Wyoming Territory. 1883, the stagecoach door swung open with a rattle of dust and iron, and the driver barked a name that turned heads at the Cheyenne depot. Miss Susanna Fairley, a slight woman in a pale blue traveling dress, stepped down, her gloved hand gripping the edge of the door. She stood still for a moment, blinking into the sharp light. Her bonnet cast a shadow over her face, but the way she looked around, eyes searching, hopeful, said she was waiting for someone. No one stepped forward. Not yet. She moved carefully, her carpetbag bumping against her leg as she walked toward the depot office. The station agent glanced up from his ledger when she stopped in front of him. "I am here for Mr. Charles Dunning," she said slowly, clearly. Her voice had a softness to it, as if she only used it when necessary. The agent blinked. "You're the mail-order bride," she nodded once. He gestured toward the bench. "Wait there." Susanna sat and folded her hands in her lap. Her heart beat fast, but she kept her face calm. She had made it all this way from Illinois. She had answered Charles Dunning's letter, written back with care. She had told him everything about her hearing, about the fever when she was 10 that had stolen most of it. But she could still speak. She could still read lips. She could be a wife. 10 minutes later, a man in a brown suit stomped into the depot. His eyebrows were already drawn tight before he even looked at her. "You didn't say you were deaf," he snapped. Susanna stood slowly. "Yes, I did, in my letter, twice." He waved a hand. "I thought you meant a little." "Not this." She flinched but said nothing. He looked her over the light dress, the carpetbag, the quiet mouth, and spat on the floor. "I cannot have a wife I cannot talk to. What kind of life is that? I can speak," she said, voice steady. "And I read lips. I work hard. No. You are not what I paid for." The station agent looked up sharply. "You cannot just leave her here. She can get back on the next coach east. I will not take her." Before she could answer, he turned and left. Susanna stood frozen. Her ears rang in the silence that followed. The agent looked at her and sighed, then walked off muttering. She stepped outside into the late morning sun, the carpetbag heavier than before. She had nowhere to go. That was when she saw him. A tall man leaned against the fence by the livestock pens. He had a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a worn blue shirt rolled at the sleeves, and a quiet stillness about him. He had been watching when Susanna turned. Their eyes met. He walked over slowly. Dust crunched under his boots. Up close, his face was sun-browned, his jaw rough with stubble. He looked down at her, then at the retreating figure of Charles Dunning disappearing down the street. Then back at her. He held out a hand. Susanna blinked. I do not know where to go." He did not speak. Just looked her in the eyes and nodded. She placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, steady. He led her to his horse, untied another from the post, and helped her up gently. "I am Sylas Embry," he said once they rode out of town. "I got a ranch near Elk Hollow. Come stay till you figure your next step." She touched his arm lightly. "Thank you." He just nodded again. The ride took most of the afternoon. She watched the land roll out, tall grass, wide sky, the mountains in the distance like a promise. His ranch sat low in a valley, 2 small barns and a main house built of rough timber. He helped her down, then walked her to the porch. Inside was simple but clean: wood stove, table, 2 chairs, a Bible on the shelf, and a bed in the corner with a quilted cover. He brought her a basin of water and a towel, then made coffee and beans over the fire. They ate in silence. When she looked up at him across the table, he met her gaze. He pointed to himself. "Sylas." Then pointed to her. "Susanna," she said. He nodded. A pause. Then he said, "You can stay as long as you want. No expectations." She swallowed. "I will find work. I can sew, cook." He shook his head. "You do not owe me anything." Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them away. He did not look away from her. That night, she lay on the cot in the corner. He had taken a blanket to sleep on the floor near the stove. She watched the firelight move across the beams and listened to the quiet sounds of the ranch. No shouting, no slamming doors, no cruel words, just the sound of Sylas Embry breathing steady on the floor nearby. The next morning, he saddled up without a word and rode out. He came back hours later with flour, sugar, and a small bag of apples. He handed them to her at the doorway. Her hands shook. "I will bake you a pie." He smiled just a little and tipped his hat. Over the next days she swept the floors, mended his shirts, and learned the rhythm of the place. He said little, but always met her eyes. Sometimes she caught him watching her hands as she kneaded dough, or the way she tilted her head to read his lips. One evening after dinner, she stepped outside and found him fixing the fence by lantern light. She walked over and stood beside him. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He looked at her a long moment. "Because no one should be thrown away." She nodded, heart tight in her chest. "You do not talk much," she said. He gave a quiet smile. "Words are not always needed." That night, as she climbed into bed, she turned to look at him across the room. He was still awake, staring at the ceiling. "I feel safe here," she whispered. He turned his head slowly. "Good." In the weeks that followed, the silence between them became something different, not empty, just easy. They worked side by side, mending the chicken coop, gathering firewood, tending the small garden behind the house. One dusk, she brought him water as he worked the corral. He took it from her hands and their fingers brushed. He did not look away. "Thank you," he said softly. She nodded, her throat tight. Then he reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She froze. He did not pull back. Her voice was quiet. "I have never been looked at the way you look at me." "You deserve it," he said. She blinked fast. Then he took her hand again like he had that day at the depot, and again he just nodded, but this time she nodded back. The first frost came early that year. Morning light spilled across the valley in pale ribbons, clinging to the low hills like breath on glass. Sylas had risen before the sky softened, his boots already damp with dew as he checked the fence line along the eastern pasture. He didn't wake Susanna. She'd sat up much of the night, sewing patches into an old wool coat he hadn't worn since the war. When she stepped out onto the porch, the coat was folded neatly beside the door. He picked it up without a word, slid his arms through the sleeves, and nodded once in thanks, his eyes soft with something she hadn't seen in him before. Not gratitude exactly. Something quieter, something she didn't yet have a name for. She spent the morning boiling potatoes and rendering suet, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. The kitchen took on a warm, earthy scent. Sylas returned just as the noon sun cut the chill from the air. He unlaced his boots at the door, shook the dust loose from his hat, and joined her at the table. "You always keep your hands busy," he said, lifting the tin cup she'd filled for him. She glanced down at her fingers, stained faintly from the dye she'd used to mend a faded curtain. "If they're not busy," she said, "I start remembering things I'd rather not." He studied her face. "What do you remember?" She hesitated. "A house with threadbare floors, a father who came home angry more often than not." Her voice dropped. "People speak louder when they think you're broken, as if volume will force your ears to work again." He didn't interrupt, just waited. "I used to hide under the stairs with a book," she went on. "I'd watch the words move on the page and imagine them being spoken kindly." Sylas leaned back. "You're not broken. I know that now." She met his eyes. "I didn't, for a long time." That afternoon, a wagon rolled in from the north trail, its wheels creaking beneath a load of cedar posts. Sylas traded 2 sacks of oats and a pair of hand-forged hinges for the lumber, then waved the driver off with a nod. When he turned back, Susanna was kneeling by the chicken coop, coaxing one of the hens with a bit of cornmeal. The hem of her dress was streaked with dust, and her hair had slipped loose from its pins. She was laughing, silent but unmistakable. Her shoulders shook gently, and her eyes brightened as the hen finally hopped into her lap. He leaned on the fence and watched her for a while. That evening, she found him sitting on the back step, a carving knife in one hand and a strip of pine in the other. The wood curled softly under his blade. He didn't look up as she approached, but she saw the corners of his mouth lift. "What are you making?" she asked, not sure yet, just seeing what's inside it. She lowered herself beside him. "You do that a lot." "Do what?" "Wait to see what something becomes." He ran a thumb along the edge of the carving. "Most things aren't what they look like at first." They sat in silence until the sun dipped behind the ridge. Then she spoke. "Did you ever marry?" He shook his head. "Almost. But she wanted Kansas City. I wanted this." "Do you ever regret it?" "No." He glanced at her. I was engaged once. He called it off after he met my mother. She told him I was a burden." Sylas frowned. "You're not." "I know." She drew her knees to her chest. "But it still hurts." They sat without speaking for a long time. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. He laid the carving down between them, a bird in flight, its wings not yet finished. "You can stay here," he said finally. "Not just for now. If you want it." She turned to him. "And if I want more than just a place?" His voice was steady. "Then I'll give more if you ask." She reached for his hand, fingers slipping into the spaces between his. "I'm asking." He didn't answer with words, he just held on. The snow came in November, early and thick. It moved in quiet, blanketing the valley with a hush that softened every sound, every edge. Susanna watched it fall from the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her breath trailing out in faint clouds. Sylas was splitting kindling beneath the overhang, his sleeves damp from where he'd brushed snow off the woodpile. His axe struck in steady rhythm, each motion measured, grounded. She stepped down and took up the basket beside the door. "I'll bring in the eggs before they freeze," she said. He paused and nodded once, then handed her the lantern. Inside the henhouse the air was warmer, close with the scent of straw and feathers. The hens clucked low as she moved among them, her hands practiced now. She'd learned the rhythm of this place, of its work and silence. She'd learned the way Sylas moved through the world, not with noise, but with presence. When she returned, the fire was going strong inside. He had laid out a piece of smoked venison and a jar of pickled beans on the table, along with the carving he'd started weeks before. It had changed. The wings now stretched wide, the lines cleaner, more certain. "You finished it," she said, setting the eggs down. He glanced at it. "Took time to see what it wanted to be." She traced the edge of the wing with one finger. "You always make room for things to become what they are." He looked at her for a long moment. "So should everyone." Later, while the wind pressed against the windows and the fire settled low, she sat at the table, writing with a stub of pencil on the back of a paper sack. He noticed the way her brow furrowed, how her mouth moved slightly as she formed each word. "You writing someone?" he asked. She shook her head. "Myself. I write things down so I don't lose them." "Like what?" "Things I didn't say when I should have. Things I never knew how to explain." He nodded, quiet. "And you?" she asked. "What do you keep to yourself?" He leaned back, eyes on the fire. "I got a brother in Montana. We haven't spoken since '71. "Why not?" "He married a woman who didn't think much of me. Said a rancher with no money wasn't worth the trouble." He agreed. She watched him carefully. "Have you wanted to write him?" "Plenty of times." He ran a hand over his jaw. "But I never did. I figured he made his peace with it. Maybe he's waiting for you to make yours." He didn't answer, but his eyes lingered on the fire a little longer. In the days that followed, the snow deepened. They moved through the short daylight hours without rush, chopping wood, drying apples, sewing patches into the saddle blankets. At night, she read aloud from an old book of sermons, her voice low and steady. He didn't care for the scripture much, but he liked the sound of her voice in the quiet. She spoke each word with care, as if giving it weight. One evening, after the dishes were washed and the fire banked low, she stood in the doorway holding her shawl. "Would you walk with me?" He didn't ask where. Just pulled on his coat and followed. The moon was high, casting silver over the snow. They walked past the barn, their boots crunching softly, until they reached the hill behind the house. She stopped where the land dipped down toward the creek, the world pale and quiet around them. "I used to dream of a place like this," she said. "Not for the land or the sky, for the stillness." He looked out over the valley, then back at her. "I never thought I'd have someone to share it with." She turned to him, the wind catching a loose strand of hair at her temple. He reached up and tucked it behind her ear without thinking. "You do now," she said. He met her gaze. "I know." She stepped closer, her hand pressing lightly against his chest. "I never wanted to be taken in out of pity." "I never offered it." Her eyes didn't leave his. "Then what did you offer?" He didn't speak. Instead, he lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips once, gently. Then he said, "Whatever's mine to give." She let out a breath that trembled at the end, and for the first time since arriving, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He stood still, the warmth of her soaking through the cold wool of his coat. The stars above them burned clean and sharp. She didn't ask for promises. He didn't offer any, but when they turned back toward the house, he reached for her hand again, and this time she held on first. The days shortened in quiet increments. By late afternoon, the sun had already slipped behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows over the barnyard. Sylas stood in the doorway of the tack room, oiling the leather of his saddle with slow, practiced strokes. The smell of lye soap and old oats hung in the air. From the house came the faint clatter of a tin pan being set down and the dry whisper of broom bristles on plank floorboards. He set the saddle aside and wiped his hands on a scrap of muslin. When he stepped into the yard, Susanna was perched on the low bench beside the well, her skirts tucked beneath her knees, mending one of the canvas feed bags with a curved needle and thick thread. She looked up when he approached, her needle paused in mid-loop. "I've been thinking," she said, watching his mouth, "about how this place could take on more." He crouched beside her. "More what? Work. Yield. We could plant a second patch of potatoes come spring. And you've got enough fencing now to close off that low pasture near the creek." Sylas rested his forearms on his knees. "You thinking of staying?" "I'm not thinking of leaving." Her words didn't tremble. His eyes searched hers and something eased in his shoulders. "I never wanted to speak for you," he said. "Didn't want to make you feel kept." "You didn't," she replied. "You made me feel welcome. That's not the same." He reached for the feed bag, held it steady while she sewed. The silence that fell between them this time was filled with quiet comfort, not caution. When she finished the last stitch, she handed him the bag and stood, brushing lint from her palms. "You ever think about going into town?" she asked. He stood as well, lifting the bag over one shoulder. "Only when I need something I can't make myself." "There's a sewing circle at the church," she said. "They meet Thursday mornings. I thought I'd go." He nodded. "You want me to come with you?" "No," she said, smiling faintly. "But I want you to be there when I get back." He watched her walk toward the house, her boots leaving neat impressions in the dusted snow. The lamplight inside flickered against the window pane as she stepped through. 2 days later, they rose before dawn. She packed a small basket with the scarf she'd been working on and a tin of dried apple slices. He hitched the buckboard without speaking, and she tucked herself beneath a wool blanket on the bench beside him. The road to town was rutted, the trees along the way bare and aching. They passed a pair of mule deer standing motionless at the tree line. Sylas tipped his hat toward them out of habit. At the edge of Cheyenne, he pulled the team to a stop near the church. She laid a hand on his wrist. "I'll be back before the bell rings noon." "I'll wait at the smith," he said. "Old Buckley's got a chain needs tempering." She stepped down, adjusting her gloves. Before she turned, she looked up at him. "Don't leave without me." "I won't." The church door creaked open behind her, and she disappeared inside. Sylas crossed the street and found the blacksmith's forge already glowing red. He worked the bellows for a few hours, trading labor for a new latch he'd been meaning to ask after. Around mid-morning, he stepped outside to stretch his legs. The sky had cleared and the wind had dropped. He leaned against the hitch post, watching a group of children chase one another past the mercantile. Then he saw her. She was standing on the church steps, her basket in the crook of one arm, speaking with an older woman in a green shawl. Her head tilted slightly as she watched the woman's lips, nodding every so often. When the conversation ended, Susanna turned and caught sight of him across the street. She didn't wave. She just crossed the road slowly, her boots crunching over the frozen mud, and came to stand in front of him. "They asked me to come back next week," she said. "I told them yes." He looked at her face, the flush in her cheeks from the cold, the way her eyes held steady. "I'm glad you did." She hesitated. One of the women asked how long we've been married. He let that settle between them. "What did you tell her?" I said we weren't. "Yet." He didn't look away. "You want to be?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded once. Then he took her hand again, same as he had the first time. And this time she laced her fingers through his and didn't let go. The wedding was held the last Friday of March, just as the frost began to lift its hold from the valley. No church bells rang and no satin ribbons trimmed the doorframes, but the table was set with care, and the parlor smelled faintly of yeast rolls and sweet sage. Sylas wore a clean white shirt she had pressed that morning, the collar slightly askew no matter how she tugged at it. Susanna stood in a dark plum dress she had sewn from bolts traded with the mercantile seamstress, the skirt falling heavy and full over her boots. She had braided her hair back in a crown, a small silver comb tucked behind her left ear. A traveling circuit preacher from Rawlins, gray-bearded and sunburned, read the vows in a calm, steady voice. They stood side by side before the hearth, hands joined, the fire low but steady behind them. When the preacher asked if they would take one another in bond and trust, they both answered without pause. After, Sylas reached for her face and kissed her once, gently, as though the moment itself were something to be handled with care. The few neighbors they had invited, mostly ranchers from the far edge of the hollow, and their wives clapped politely and lingered only long enough to share a slice of apple cake and leave their blessings. By dusk, the house was quiet again. Sylas stood by the stove, filling 2 tin cups with the last of the cider. "You sure this is the life you want?" She took the cup from him and sat in the chair nearest the fire. "I made my choice. I'd make it again." He sat across from her, one boot resting over the other knee. "There's an old short-handled spade in the shed. I've been meaning to clear a patch near the creek for spring onions. I'll help you dig it tomorrow." He raised his cup slightly in her direction. "To spring." She touched hers to his. "To what comes next." That night, she didn't sleep in the corner cot. She folded the quilts there and placed them inside the chest at the foot of their shared bed, then turned back to find him waiting, already beneath the covers, one arm outstretched. She climbed in, settled against him, and closed her eyes. In April they planted the onions. She knelt in the soft, damp dirt, pressing seeds into the furrows he carved. He moved beside her, his shadow long across the soil. They worked in rhythm, neither rushing. When she stood, brushing earth from her skirts, He touched a bit of soil that clung to her cheek and wiped it away with the back of his hand. By May, the chickens had begun laying regular again, and Susanna set aside eggs to trade for bolts of muslin and a new kettle. She joined the sewing circle every other week, walking into town with a neighbor woman who passed their gate on her way. Sylas never asked what they spoke of there. He only asked if she'd be home before dark. One evening in June, as the sun poured orange light across the pasture, she sat on the porch mending a tear in the shoulder of his work shirt. He came up the steps, wiping sweat from his brow, and handed her a small pouch. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a hair comb, carved from bone. The shape matched the one she wore at the wedding, but finer, more detailed. A meadowlark in its center, wings stretched wide. "I had Buckley's boy help me etch it." She turned it over in her palm, tracing the bird's shape with her fingertip. "It's beautiful." He crouched beside her, resting a hand on her knee. "You said once you used to imagine people speaking kindly." She nodded. "I want to speak like that." "Always." She leaned in, kissed the corner of his mouth, and whispered, "You already do." That summer passed slowly, the way good years do. They built a second coop, added 3 goats to the pen, and dug a shallow root cellar behind the house. When storms rolled in, they sat shoulder to shoulder by the fire, reading aloud or simply listening to the rain work its way across the roof. One Sunday morning, as she knelt beside the stove, she pressed a hand low against her belly, the way a woman sometimes does when she begins to suspect something. Sylas noticed the motion but said nothing until she turned to him with a quiet smile. "There's a new life coming," she said simply. He crossed the room and placed his hand over hers. "Then we'll make room." And they did. They built a cradle from pine boards cut behind the barn. She sewed blankets from scraps, each one stitched with the quiet patience of a woman who had waited a long time for peace and now had it. The baby, a girl, was born in early February, while the wind howled across the hollow and the snow piled up against the window panes. Sylas held her first, wrapped in a quilt no larger than a flour sack. He looked down at her face and then at Susanna, who lay exhausted but smiling in the bed they had shared for nearly a year now. "She's steady," Susanna said, watching them. He traced the baby's cheek with one finger. "She's home." They named her Elia after a word Susanna had seen once in a book, gentle, enduring, years past. The ranch grew not with wealth but with rhythm and purpose. Neighbors came more often. The house filled with laughter, with soft steps and small hands. Sylas taught Elia to ride by the time she was 5. Susanna taught her to listen with her eyes, to speak with kindness, to be still when stillness was needed. One autumn evening, Sylas stood beside the fence where he had first seen Susanna years before, just after that cold spring morning in Cheyenne. He looked out over the pasture, where Elia chased a chicken with too much enthusiasm and not enough direction. Susanna came to stand beside him, her hand slipping easily into his. "You remember that day?" he asked. "I remember thinking no one had ever looked at me like I mattered." He turned to her. "You always mattered." "I just saw it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their daughter tumble into the grass, laughing. "I'm glad I stayed. I never would have let you go." The wind passed through the grass, and somewhere in the trees a bird called. They stood there a long while, the 3 of them held by the light, by the land, by the quiet bond that had grown not from grand words or sudden sparks, but from steady hands, shared strength, and the slow, hard-earned love of people who had chosen one another, again and again, without ever needing to be asked.